On March 9th, 5 days after Stalin's death in 1953, Mao Zedong, a revolutionary leader of China, published the following eulogy for Stalin in the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, known as the People's Daily. Comrade Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the greatest genius of the present age, the great teacher of the world communist movement, and the comrade in arms of the immortal Lenin, has departed from the world. Comrade Stalin's contribution to our era through his theoretical activities and practice is incalculable. Comrade Stalin represents our entire new age. His activities have led the Soviet people and the working people of all countries to turn around the whole world situation. That is to say, the cause of justice and of people's democracy and socialism has achieved victory in an immense region of the world, a region embracing more than 800 million people, 1/3 of the Earth's population. Moreover, the influence of this victory is daily spreading to every corner of the world. The death of Comrade Stalin has caused the laboring people of the whole world to feel unparalleled and profound grief. It has stirred the hearts of just people throughout the world. This demonstrates that Comrade Stalin's cause and his thought have gripped the broad masses of the people throughout the world and have already become an invincible force, a force that will guide those people who have already achieved victory in achieving still more fresh victories, one after another. And, at the same time, will guide all those people who are still groaning under the oppression of the evil old world of capitalism so that they can strike courageously at the enemies of the people. After the death of Lenin, Comrade Stalin led the Soviet people in building into a magnificent socialist society, the first socialist state in the world, which he, together with the great Lenin, created at the time of the October Revolution. The victory of socialist construction in the Soviet Union was not only a victory for the people of the Soviet Union, but also a common victory for the people of the whole world. First, this victory proved in the most real, live terms the infinite correctness of Marxism-Leninism and concretely educated working people throughout the world on how they should advance toward a good life. Second, this victory ensured that during the Second World War, humanity would have the strength to defeat the fascist beast. The achievement of victory in the anti-fascist war and the glory for those victories should be attributed to our great comrade Stalin. Comrade Stalin developed Marxist-Leninist theory in a comprehensive and epoch-making way and propelled the development of Marxism to a new stage. Comrade Stalin creatively developed Lenin's theory concerning the law of the uneven development of capitalism and the theory that it is possible for socialism to first achieve victory in one country. Comrade Stalin creatively contributed to the theory of the general crisis of the capitalist system. He contributed to the theory concerning the building of communism in the Soviet Union. He contributed to the theory of the fundamental economic laws of present-day capitalism and of socialism. He contributed to the theory of revolution in the colonies and semi-colonies. Comrade Stalin also creatively developed Lenin's theory of party building. All these creative theories of Comrade Stalin's further united the workers throughout the world, further united the oppressed classes and oppressed people throughout the world, thereby enabling the struggle of the world's working class and all oppressed people for liberation and well-being and the victories in this struggle to reach unprecedented proportions. All of Comrade Stalin's writings are immortal documents of Marxism. His works, The Foundations of Leninism, The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and his last great work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, constitute an encyclopedia of Marxism-Leninism. A synthesis of the experience of the world communist movement of the past 100 years, his speech at the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union is a precious last testament bequeathed to the communists of all the countries of the world. We Chinese communists, like the communists of all countries, search for our own road to victory in the great works of Comrade Stalin. Since the death of Lenin, Comrade Stalin has always been the central figure in the world communist movement. We rallied around him, constantly asked his advice, and constantly drew ideological strength from his works. Comrade Stalin was full of warmth for the oppressed people of the East. Do not forget the East. This was Comrade Stalin's greatest call after the October Revolution. Everyone knows that Comrade Stalin warmly loved the Chinese people and regarded the might of the Chinese Revolution as incalculable. On the question of the Chinese Revolution, he contributed his exalted wisdom. It was by following the teachings of Lenin and Stalin, along with having the support of the great Soviet state and all the revolutionary forces of other countries, that the Communist Party of China and the Chinese people achieved their historic victory a few years ago. Now, we have lost our great teacher and most sincere friend, Comrade Stalin. What a misfortune this is. The sorrow that this misfortune has brought us cannot be described in words. Our task is to transform sorrow into strength in memory of our great teacher Stalin, the great friendship between the Communist Party of China and the Chinese people on the one hand, and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Soviet people on the other, formed in the name of Stalin, will never cease to be strengthened. The Chinese communists and the Chinese people will further intensify the study of Stalin's teachings and the study of Soviet science and technology in order to build our country. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union is a party nurtured personally by Lenin and Stalin. It is the most advanced, the most experienced, and the most theoretically cultivated party in the world. This party has been our model in the past. It is our model at present, and will still be our model in the future. We fully believe that the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the government of the Soviet Union, headed by Comrade Malenkov, will definitely be able to carry on Comrade Stalin's unfinished work and push the great cause of communism forward and carry it to greater and more glorious development. There is not the slightest doubt that the camp of world peace, democracy, and socialism, headed by the Soviet Union, will become even more united and even more powerful. In the past 30 years, Comrade Stalin's teachings and the model of the construction of socialism in the Soviet Union have facilitated a major step forward for the world. Now that the Soviet Union has become so powerful, the Chinese People's Revolution has achieved such great victories, construction in the various people's democracies has achieved such great success, the movement of the peoples of various countries throughout the world against oppression and aggression has risen to such heights, and our front of friendship and solidarity is so consolidated, we can say with complete certainty that we are not afraid of any imperialist aggression. Any imperialist aggression will be smashed by us, and all their despicable provocation will be to no avail. The reason that the great friendship between the peoples of the two countries, China and the Soviet Union, is unbreakable is that our friendship has been built on the great principles of the internationalism of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. The friendship between the peoples of the two countries, China and the Soviet Union, and the peoples of the various people's democracies, as well as with all the people who love peace, democracy, and justice in all the countries of the world, is also built upon these great principles of internationalism and consequently is also unbreakable. Clearly, the strength created by this kind of friendship of ours is inexhaustible and truly invincible. Let all imperialist aggressors and warmongers tremble before our great friendship. Long live the teachings of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. Immortal glory to the heroic name of the great Stalin.
Welcome to Proles Pod.
Welcome back to Proles Pod. This is Tony. In this episode, we'll be ending the narrative sections for the Stalin Era series with part 4.5 titled Long Live Comrade Stalin, which focuses on Stalin's final years from 1943 to 1953. This narrative covers the final years of the Great Patriotic War, detailing what led to Soviet victory, the emergence of Cold War tensions, and finally, the end of Stalin's life. The Stalin Eras is the most in-depth podcast series on the life and times of Joseph Stalin. If you somehow stumbled onto this without listening from the beginning, we highly recommend you start with episode 63, The Stalin Eras, an introduction, 1878 to 1917. After finishing this episode, if you're starved for more content about this era, we suggest checking out the Proles Pod and Actually Existing Socialism back catalog that gets into some of the more granular histories outside the scope of this project. The Proles Pod team extends a heartfelt thank you to all of our listeners. Your constructive feedback, likes, subscriptions, encouragement, and ideas have helped fuel this project. Special thanks particularly to our listeners who have supported us on Patreon at patreon.com/ProlesPod, where you can find additional content. It is no exaggeration to say that there is no The Stalin Eras without your continued support. Enjoy the episode.
The Last Witnesses. In 1985, Svetlana Alexievich published The Last Witnesses, an oral history of the children of World War II. A poignant collection of heart-wrenching accounts from those who survived the Great Patriotic War as children. These experiences are seldom heard in the West. For this section of the narrative, we will share some of these stories. Content warning. The following accounts contain descriptions of extreme trauma, loss, and violence. Before each story, we will provide the individual's name, their age during the war, and their occupation at the time of publication in the mid-1980s, as noted in the original text. Dima Sufrenkov, 5 years old, now a mechanical engineer. Till then I had only been afraid of mice, but all at once there were so many fears, 1,000 fears. My child's conscience wasn't so much struck by the word war as frightened by the word airplanes. Airplanes, and our mother grabs us all off the stove. We were afraid to get off the stove, afraid to leave the cottage. So while she takes one off, the other climbs back. There were 5 of us, and also our beloved cat. The planes strafed us. Mama tied the younger ones with her towels, and the older ones ran by ourselves. When you're little, you live in a different world. You don't see what's high up. You live close to the ground. There, the planes are still more frightening. I remember being envious of bugs. They were so small that they could hide somewhere, crawl into the ground. I imagined that when I died, I'd become some animal, run away to the forest. The plane strafed us. My cousin, she was 10 years old, carried our little 3-year-old brother. She ran, and her strength failed her. She fell down. They lay in the snow all night, and he froze to death. but she survived. We dug a hole to bury him, and she wouldn't let us. Mashenka, don't die. Why are you dying? We escaped from the Germans and lived in a swamp on little islands. We built kurens and lived in them. A kuren is a little hut, bare logs, and a hole in the top for smoke. Underneath is the ground. We lived in them winter and summer, slept on pine branches. Once, Mama and I went back from the forest to the village to take something from our cottage. The Germans were there. Whoever they found, they herded into the school. They made us kneel and aimed machine guns at us. We children were at the same height as the machine guns. We heard shooting in the forest. The Germans shouted, "Partisans! Partisans!" and ran to their trucks. They left quickly. We went back to the forest. After the war, I was afraid of metal. A piece of shrapnel lies there, and I'm afraid it will explode again. Our neighbor's girl, she was 3 years and 2 months old. I remember it. Her mama kept saying over the coffin, 3 years and 2 months, 3 years and 2 months. She had found a pineapple and started rocking it like a doll wrapped in some rags and rocked it. The grenade was small, like a toy, but very heavy. Her mother came running, but it was too late. For 2 years after the war, children were buried in our village of Old Golochivsky in the Petrovsky district. Military metal lay about everywhere, exploded black tanks, armored troop carriers, pieces of mines, bombs. We had no toys. Later on, it was all collected and sent to factories somewhere. Mama explained that this metal would be used to make tractors. Whenever I saw a new tractor, I didn't go near it. I expected it to explode and to turn black like a tank. I knew what metal it was made of. Vera Novikova, 13 years old, now a tramway dispatcher. It was so long ago, but it's still frightening. I remember such a sunny day. The wind ruffles the spider webs. Our village is burning. Our house is burning. We come out of the forest, the little children cry, a bonfire, beautiful! And all the others weep. Mama weeps and crosses herself. The house is burned down. We rummaged in the ashes but didn't find anything, only charred forks. The stove stayed as it had stood. There was food in it, potato pancakes. Mama took the frying pan out of her hands. Eat, children. It was impossible to eat those pancakes. They smelled so much of smoke, but we ate them because we had nothing else but grass. All we had left was grass and the ground. It was so long ago, but it's still frightening. My cousin was hanged. Her husband was the commander of a partisan unit, and she was pregnant. Someone denounced her to the Germans, and they came. They chased everybody out to the square, ordered that no one should cry. Next to the village council grew a tall tree. They drove the horse up to it. My cousin stood on the sledge. She had a long braid. They put the noose around her neck. She took the braid out of it. The horse pulled the sledge away, and she hung there, spinning. The women shouted. They shouted without tears, just with voices. We weren't allowed to cry. We could shout, but not cry, not be sorry. They came up and killed those who cried. There were adolescent boys, 16 or 17 years old. They were shot. They had cried. So young. As yet, neither suitors nor soldiers. Why have I told you this? It's more frightening for me now than then. Lena Krivchenko, 7 years old. Now an accountant. Of course, I knew nothing about death. No one had time to explain it, but I just saw it. When the machine guns rattle away from an airplane, it feels as if all the bullets are aimed at you, in your direction. I begged Mama, dear, lie on me. She would lie on me, and then I didn't see or hear anything. Most frightening was to lose Mama. I saw a dead young woman with a baby nursing at her breast. She must have been killed a minute before. The baby didn't even cry, and I was sitting right there. As long as I don't lose Mama. Mama holds my hand all the time and strokes my head. Everything will be all right. Everything will be all right. We rode in some truck, and all the children wore buckets on their heads. I didn't obey Mama. Then I remember we're being driven in a column. They're taking my Mama away from me. I seize her hands. I clutch at her marquisate dress. She wasn't dressed for war. It was her fancy dress, her best. I won't let her go. I cry. The fascist shoves me aside with his submachine gun, and then when I'm on the ground with his boot, some woman picks me up. Now she and I are, for some reason, riding on a train. Where? She calls me Anechka. But I think I had a different name. I seem to remember that it was different, but what it was I forgot. From fear. From fear that they'd taken my Mama from me. Where are we going? I seem to understand the conversation of the adults that were being taken to Germany. I remember my thoughts. Why do the Germans need such a little girl? What am I going to do there? When it grew dark, the women took me to the door of the car and just pushed me out. Run from it. Run for it. Maybe you'll save yourself. I landed in some ditch and fell asleep there. It was cold. And I dreamed that Mama was wrapping me in something warm and saying gentle words. I've had that dream all my life. 25 years after the war, I found just one of my aunts. She told me my real name, and for a long time I couldn't get used to it. I didn't respond to it. Volodya Barsuk, 12 years old, now chairman of the Council of the Spartacus Athletic Society of the Belarusian Republic. We joined the partisans at once. Our whole family, Papa, Mama, my brother, and me. My brother was older. They gave him a rifle. I envied him, and he taught me to shoot. Once my brother didn't come back from a mission. For a long time, Mama refused to believe he was dead. Our unit received information that a partisan group surrounded by the Germans had blown themselves up with an anti-tank mine, so as not to be taken alive. Mama suspected that our Alexander was there. He hadn't been sent with that group, but he could have met them. She went to the unit commander and said, "I sense that my son is lying with them. Allow me to go there." She was given several fighters, and we went. And here is a mother's heart for you. The fighters began to dig in one place, but my Mama pointed to another. "Dig here." They began to dig and found my brother. He was no longer recognizable. He was all black. Mama recognized him by a scar from appendicitis and by the comb in his pocket. I always remember my Mama. During the war, we recalled all the time how we lived before the war. We lived all together, several related families in one big house. We lived cheerfully and amiably. On payday, Aunt Lena bought a lot of pastry and cheeses, gathered all the children, and treated them. She was killed, along with her husband and her son. All my uncles were killed. The war ended. I remember my Mama and me walking down the street. She was carrying some potatoes she had been given at the factory where she worked. A German prisoner came to us from the ruins of a building. Mama said, "I won't give you anything. Maybe you killed my son." The German was taken aback and said nothing. Mama went on. Then she turned back, took out a few potatoes and gave them to him. "Here, eat." Now I was taken aback. During the war, we took rides several times on frozen German corpses. They could be found outside town long after the war. We used them as sleds. You could kick the dead man with your foot. We jumped on them. We went on hating them. Mama taught me. That was my first post-war lesson in love. Artur Kuziv, 10 years old, now a hotel administrator. Someone was ringing the bell, pulling and pulling. Our church had long been closed. I don't even remember when it was closed. It had always been a kolkhoz warehouse. Grain was kept in it. Hearing the long dead bell, the village was dumbstruck. Calamity! Mama, everybody rushed outside. That was how the war began. I close my eyes, I see. 3 Red Army soldiers are being led down the road, their arms tied behind them with barbed wire. They're in their underwear. 2 are young, 1 an older man. They walk with their heads down. They are shot near the school on the road. In the last moments, they begin to shout their names loudly in hopes that someone would hear and remember them, inform their relatives. I watched through a hole in the fence, I remember. One was Venechka Balai, the other Roman Nikanov. And the one who was older shouted, "Long live Comrade Stalin!" And right after that, the trucks began to move down the road. Heavy German trucks, and they lay there, trucks with soldiers, and ammunition rode over them, followed by motorcycles. The Germans rode and rode by day and by night for many days. And I kept repeating. I'd wake up at night and repeat, Venechka Balai, Roman, Nikanov, and the third man's name I didn't know. Yura Karpovich, 8 years old. Now, a driver. I saw what shouldn't be seen. What a man shouldn't see, and I was little. I saw a soldier who was running and seemed to stumble. He fell. For a long time he clawed at the ground, he clung to it. I saw how they drove our prisoners of war through the village, in long columns, in torn and burned greatcoats. Where they stayed overnight, the bark was gnawed off the trees. Instead of food, they threw them a dead horse. The men tore it to pieces. I saw a German train go off the rails and burn up during the night, and in the morning, they laid all those who worked for the railroad on the tracks and drove a locomotive over them. I saw how they harnessed people to a carriage. They had yellow stars on their backs. They drove them with whips. They rode along merrily. I saw how they knocked children from their mother's arms with bayonets and threw them into the fire, into a well. Our turn, Mama's and mine, didn't come. I saw my neighbor's dog crying. He sat in the ashes of our neighbor's house, alone. He had an old man's eyes. And I was little. I grew up with this. I grew up gloomy and mistrustful. I have a difficult character. When someone cries, I don't feel sorry. On the contrary, I feel better because I, myself, don't know how to cry. I've been married twice, and twice my wife has left me. No one could stand me for long. It's hard to love me. I know it myself. Many years have passed. Now I want to ask, did God watch this? And what did he think? Dunya Golubeva, 11 years old. Now, a milker. War. But we still had to plow. Mama, my sister, and brother went to the fields to sow linseed. They drove off, and an hour later, not more, women came running. Your people have been shot, Dunya. They're lying in the field. My mother lay on a sack, and the grain was pouring out of it. There were many, many little bullet holes. I remained alone with my little nephew. My sister had recently given birth, but her husband was with the partisans. It was me and this little boy. I didn't know how to milk the cow. She was bellowing in the stable. She sensed that her mistress was gone. The dog howled all night long. So did the cow. The baby clung to me. He wanted my breast. I remembered how my sister fed him. I pulled out my nipple for him. He sucked and fell asleep. I had no milk, but he got tired and fell asleep. Where did he catch cold? How did he get sick? I was little. What did I know? He coughed and coughed. We had nothing to eat. The police, had already taken away the cow. And so the little boy died. Moaned and died. I heard it grow quiet. I lifted the little sheet. He laid there, all black. Only his little face was white. It remained clean. Night. Dark windows, where to go? I'll wait till morning. In the morning I'll call people. I sat and wept because there was no one in the house, not even that little boy. Day was breaking. I put him in a trunk. We had kept our grandfather's trunk where he stored his tools, a small trunk, like a box. I was afraid that cats or rats would come and gnaw at him. He lay there so small. Smaller than when he was alive. I wrapped him in a clean towel, a linen one, and kissed him. The little trunk was just his size. Released in the same year as The Last Witnesses, Elem Klimov's film, Come and See, stands as one of the most powerful anti-war films ever made. With vivid realism, it depicts the brutality and sadism inflicted on Soviet citizens during the Nazi occupation, particularly in Belarus. The film is a harrowing testament to the horrors of fascism and the resilience of those who endured it and ultimately defeated it. Together with Svetlana Alexievich's The Last Witnesses, Come and See serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of the Great Patriotic War and the enduring scars it left on Soviet society. Both works challenge viewers and readers to confront the darkest chapters of history, ensuring that the memories of those who suffered are not forgotten.
Soviet victory over fascism. The Soviet Union's experience during the Great Patriotic War is one of the most extraordinary chapters in modern history. It was a conflict marked by unimaginable suffering, heroic resistance, and ultimately, a hard-fought victory over fascism. While the war's totality is too vast to cover in detail for the Stalin-era series, this section of the narrative focuses on the key elements that defined the Soviet victory: the early resilience of 1941, the turning point at Stalingrad, the unity and sacrifice of the Soviet people, and the navigation of the complex dynamics with Western allies. Together, these factors reveal how the USSR not only survived the Nazi onslaught, but emerged as the decisive force in defeating fascism. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, it marked the beginning of the largest and bloodiest military campaign in history. Hitler's war machine, which had swept through Western Europe with a literal drug-fueled intensity, now turned its full force towards the Soviet Union. The initial months of the invasion were devastating. The Nazis advanced rapidly, capturing vast territories and encircling entire Soviet armies. By the end of 1941, they were within striking distance of Moscow. Yet despite these early setbacks, the seeds of Soviet victory were already being sown. As we've already covered, the Red Army was not unprepared. The Soviet Union had learned valuable lessons from recent conflicts, such as the battles against Japan at Khalkhin Gol and the Winter War with Finland. These experiences, though costly, had hardened Soviet troops and provided new insights into modern warfare. Soviet military strategists also studied the Nazis' blitzkrieg tactics, which relied on rapid, overwhelming attacks to concentrate, encircle, and destroy enemy forces. Recognizing the dangers of concentrating troops at the border, the Soviets adopted a defense-in-depth strategy, allowing the Nazis to advance while preparing counteroffensives from fortified positions further ahead. As Marshal Georgy Zhukov later reflected, the Soviet Union would have been smashed if we had put all our soldiers at the border. By August 1941, just 2 months into the invasion, cracks began to appear in the Nazi war machine. The Germans had expected a quick victory, relying on the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of their initial assault, as other European countries had done. However, they had underestimated the resilience of the Soviet people and the vastness of the Soviet terrain. The Nazis had only prepared for a short campaign, with limited supplies of fuel, tires, and spare parts. They had not winterized their troops, assuming they would seize Soviet resources before the onset of cold weather. The Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941, launched in the brutal winter conditions, marked the first major turning point. For the first time, the Red Army not only halted the Nazi advance, but also pushed them back. This was a psychological as well as a military victory. It demonstrated that the Nazis were not invincible, and the Soviet Union could withstand the onslaught. A common myth perpetuated by Nazi propaganda and later Western narratives is that winter alone defeated Hitler's armies. While the harsh Russian winter certainly played a role, it was not the decisive factor. The Nazis' failure to prepare for a prolonged campaign and their underestimation of Soviet resilience was far more significant. The Soviet victory was rooted in strategic planning, industrial mobilization, and the sheer determination of the Soviet people. The USSR's ability to evacuate and reconvert its industries to the east away from the advancing Nazis was a logical feat of immense complexity. Over 2,500 factories and 25 million workers were relocated, often under dire circumstances. By 1942, these factories were producing the weapons and supplies needed to sustain the war effort. The winter of 1941 to 1942 exposed the Nazis' logical shortcomings, but it was the Soviet counteroffensive that actually turned the tide. The Red Army's ability to fight in extreme conditions, coupled with its growing tactical sophistication, ensured that the Nazis would never regain the upper hand. Today, there is much hay made in Western narratives about Soviet unpreparedness or failure, and much about Nazi strength and even innovation. A much more sober understanding would be one which accepts successful Soviet strategy in the face of Armageddon and Nazi arrogance and incompetence despite their early advantage. The Battle of Stalingrad, which ran from July 17, 1942 to February 2, 1943, is often regarded as the turning point of World War II. It was the largest and bloodiest urban battle in history, with staggering casualties. Approximately 1.1 million military deaths and 50,000 civilian deaths on the Soviet side, and approximately 1 million casualties on the German side. The importance of Stalingrad lay in its industrial capacity, as well as its access to the Volga River and thus Soviet oil fields. The fighting was brutal and relentless. The city became a hellscape of rubble, with every street, building, and factory a battleground. One Nazi soldier wrote this of their experience fighting in Stalingrad. "We must reach the Volga. We can see it, less than a kilometer away. We have the constant support of our aircraft and artillery. We are fighting like madmen, but cannot reach the river. The whole war for France was shorter than the fight for one Volga factory. We must be up against suicide squads. They have simply decided to fight to the last soldier." Another described the environment. "The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. It is a vast furnace lit by the reflection of the flames. And when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the outer bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure." The Soviet response to these hellish conditions is encapsulated in dark Soviet humor that emerged from the fighting. One such story goes as follows. A German soldier shouts across the battlefield to a Soviet soldier, "Why are you still fighting? You're surrounded." The Soviet soldier replies, "We're not surrounded, we're in a target-rich environment." The Soviet defenders, both military and civilian, displayed extraordinary courage. Children like 12-year-old Sasha acted as scouts, guiding troops through the ruins. Factory workers, armed with Molotov cocktails and stolen rifles, ambushed the German patrols, delaying their advance until reinforcements had arrived. The city's defenders were determined to hold Stalingrad at all costs. By February 1943, the Germans were encircled and forced to surrender. The victory at Stalingrad was not only a military triumph, but also a moral one. It shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and marked the beginning of the Red Army's final westward advance. It also brought about a renaissance in the global communist movement, as the only viable response to fascism appeared to be that of a Soviet-style communism and not of liberal democracies which folded immediately to fascist aggression. As much of the world lay in ruins, the question, what will come next, was on everyone's minds. The pre-war systems of governance had proved too weak and had led the working majority into oblivion twice in 30 years. As a result of the victory of Stalingrad, Stalin emerged as the leader of the democratic world that understood the role of government to be one of fostering a communal and worker-centric society, not one led by treacherous capitalists who alone held the means of production. The March 1943 issue of Life magazine, a popular American publication, featured a special focus on Stalin and the USSR. This highly positive reporting would become unthinkable in the West a few short years later. The Soviet victory was a collective achievement made possible by the unity and sacrifice of the Soviet people. From partisan fighters in occupied territories to Red Army soldiers drawn from every corner of the USSR's diverse population, coupled with workers organizing for production, the Communist Party's oversight and central planning, the war effort was a testament to the viability of actually existing socialism. An often overshadowed aspect of the Soviet victory is that of the Muslim-majority regions, such as Central Asia and the Caucasus. Over 1.5 million soldiers from Central Asia alone fought in major battles, including the defense of Moscow, the siege of Leningrad, and the liberation of Eastern Europe. Figures like Aliya Maldagalova, a Kazakh sniper, and Abdulkakim Ismailov, who raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, are notable examples. Central Asia also became a vital hub for evacuated industries, while women and children took on roles more traditionally held by men who had now gone to fight. The Soviet Union's ability to mobilize its ethnically diverse population and incalculable resources on an unprecedented scale was a key factor in its victory. While the war forged an alliance between the USSR, Britain, and the United States, tensions persisted. The Soviets repeatedly called for a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front, but their requests were denied until 1944. From 1941 to 1944, the USSR bore the brunt of the war, responsible for 80% of Nazi casualties by the war's end in 1945. The Western Allies focused their military might in Asia, fighting against Imperial Japan, and in Northern Africa against Italian and German fascists as a way to maintain or enlarge their colonial holdings. However, the Western Allies' delayed intervention in Western Europe had another objective. Some American generals later admitted they were fighting from the perspective with the wrong ally against the wrong enemy, as a way to express their contempt against the socialist state. As a result, the US and Britain prioritized minimizing their own losses while allowing the USSR and Nazi Germany to exhaust each other. It was only after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad in 1943 that the Allies began planning the D-Day invasion, not to defeat Hitler, whose fate was already sealed, but to prevent the USSR from dominating post-war Europe. The Normandy landings in June 1944, while significant, did not alter the war's outcome. By then, the Soviet Union had already ensured Nazi Germany's defeat. The myth of D-Day and the war's turning point obscures the USSR's pivotal role in the Allied victory. The Soviet victory over fascism was a triumph of resilience, unity, and sacrifice. It demonstrated the strength of the Soviet system and the determination of its people. While the Western Allies' contributions cannot be dismissed, such as the role they played in the Lend-Lease program, it was the USSR that bore the heaviest burden and delivered the decisive blows against Nazi Germany. The Great Patriotic War remains a defining chapter in history and as supreme evidence for the necessity of socialism over barbarism.
Brave New World. At the forefront of post-war concerns loomed the most pressing issue: reviving the USSR's shattered economy and rebuilding its devastated infrastructure. The war had exacted a staggering toll. Over 27 million lives were lost. 1,700 towns lay in ruins. The railway network, the lifeline of the vast nation, was reduced to twisted metal and rubble, and 25 million people were left homeless. The loss of millions created a severe labor shortage, hampering reconstruction efforts. Additionally, as the Nazis retreated, they deliberately destroyed infrastructure and resources, leading to widespread food shortages and famine, particularly in 1946 and 1947, when approximately 1.5 million people perished. Post-war life was marked by harsh conditions: poor housing, low wages, and persistent scarcity. These challenges inevitably bred discontent among the Soviet population, though this was tempered by a renewed commitment to socialism and the collective effort to rebuild. The following anecdotes illustrate the resilience and struggles of Soviet citizens during this period. In Leningrad, a family of 5 shared a single room in a communal apartment, with the kitchen and bathroom used by 6 other families. Despite the cramped conditions, neighbors often shared what little they had: a piece of bread, a cup of tea, and bonded over stories of survival during the war. In Moscow, a retired soldier transformed a small patch of land near his apartment into a vegetable garden. He grew potatoes, carrots, and cabbage, which he shared with his neighbors. Such acts of self-sufficiency were common as food shortages persisted and people relied on small-scale farming to supplement their rations. A young woman working in a textile factory in Ivanovo wrote in her diary about the pride she felt in producing fabric for new clothes. Despite long hours and difficult conditions, she and her co-workers understood they were contributing to the nation's recovery. The factory often held rallies to celebrate meeting production quotas. In Minsk, a school teacher struggled to teach her students in a classroom with broken windows and no heating. The children huddled together in their coats, sharing pencils and paper. Despite the hardships, she taught them songs about Soviet heroes and the promise of a brighter future. In Stalingrad, a group of workers labored day and night to rebuild a bridge destroyed during the war. When it was finally completed, the entire community celebrated with a small festival, complete with music and dancing. Back in Moscow, a young artist was commissioned to create a propaganda poster depicting a strong, smiling worker rebuilding a factory. As he painted the idealized image, he thought about his own family's struggle with hunger and the long lines for bread. Still, he took pride in his work, believing it inspired others to persevere. The promotion of socialist realism had never been more vital. Amidst these challenges, the onset of the Cold War with the West demanded Stalin's attention on the international front. Military and technological development, including the nuclear arms race, became top priorities. This focus diverted resources from domestic needs, creating a costly gap that would haunt the USSR for decades. Nevertheless, Stalin pushed for rapid advancements in science and technology, particularly in nuclear weapons and rocketry, laying the groundwork for the Soviet Union's head start in the future space race. Though the war had ended, the bloodshed continued in the new socialist states and border regions of the USSR, where nationalist insurgencies resisted communist control, especially in the Baltics and western Ukraine. These anti-communist militias caused sabotage and violence wherever they could to weaken the system well into the 1950s. Western support for these insurgencies struck Stalin as eerily reminiscent of the backing given to anti-Soviet forces during the Russian Civil War. With Soviet approval, these new socialist states initiated purges mirroring pre-war operations against kulaks and other anti-Soviet elements. Intellectuals, tradesmen, business elites, and political leaders, seen as the core of bourgeois nationalism, were targeted. Mass deportations of ethnic groups, particularly those accused of collaborating with the Nazis, continued unabated, reshaping the demographic landscape of Eastern Europe. The population transfers within socialist states were part of a wider post-war movement of people as a result of the war. The Fourth Five-Year Plan, which ran from 1946 to 1950, aimed to rebuild the Soviet economy, prioritizing heavy industry and engineering, much like the first Five-Year Plan of the 1930s. Although the USSR started from a higher industrial base in 1945 than in 1928, the war had been catastrophic. Food production, for instance, had plummeted to 60% of 1940 levels. As before, civilian needs competed with the need for industrial and military reconstruction. The plan included ambitious targets for heavy industry and laid the groundwork for future militarization. During these early rebuilding years, Stalin also sought to reassert Communist Party control over the Soviet Union. Party and Komsomol membership had surged during the war due to the massive goodwill granted to the system in their victory over fascism. Meanwhile, Stalin moved to purge problematic elements and tighten ideological conformity. In response to the American Truman Doctrine, the Soviet Union formalized the Zhdanov Doctrine, which emphasized a socialist cultural, economic, and ideological framework in the face of legitimate Western capitalist threats. If you thought the Soviet leadership's plate was already full, the international situation added even greater complexity. In the final months of World War II, the leaders of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom convened to shape the post-war world. These meetings, first in Yalta in February 1945, and later in Potsdam in the summer of 1945, were marked by a fragile optimism. The Allies had fought side by side to defeat fascism, but beneath the surface, deep ideological and geopolitical divisions were beginning to resurface. The Yalta Conference took place in the Crimean resort town of Yalta as the war in Europe neared its end. Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt met to discuss the future of Germany, the fate of Eastern Europe, and the establishment of a new international order. On the surface, the atmosphere was cordial. The Allies had achieved remarkable cooperation during the war, and there was hope that this spirit could continue into peacetime. At Yalta, the leaders reached several key agreements. Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, administered by the Soviet Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Berlin, though located deep within the Soviet zone, would also be split similarly. Reparations were a contentious issue, but it was agreed that the Soviet Union, which had borne the brunt of the war, would receive significant compensation, including industrial equipment and forced labor. The Allies also laid the groundwork for the United Nations, with the Security Council's permanent members holding veto power. By the time of the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, the world had changed dramatically. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May, and the Allies were now focused on the post-war order. But the dynamics of the alliance had shifted. Franklin D. Roosevelt had died in April, replaced by Harry S. Truman, who was far less trusting of Stalin and more anti-communist than his predecessor. Winston Churchill, who had been a key figure at Yalta, was replaced midway through the conference by Clement Attlee after losing the UK election. The Potsdam Conference was marked by growing mistrust. The Allies agreed on the demilitarization and denazification of Germany, as well as the prosecution of war criminals. However, disagreements over reparations and economic policy foreshadowed future conflicts. The Soviet Union was granted reparations from its own occupation zone, but the Western Allies resisted Stalin's demands for a share of industrial equipment from their zones. The most dramatic moment at Potsdam was Truman's revelation of the atomic bomb. Just days before the conference, the United States had successfully tested the first nuclear weapon. Truman's announcement was a clear signal to Stalin of American military dominance. The use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, while ostensibly aimed at forcing Japan's surrender, were utilized primarily as a message to the Soviet Union. The United States was willing to use its new weapon to shape the post-war world. Stalin understood this implication. He reportedly remarked the following: "Hiroshima has shaken the whole world. The balance has been broken. Build the bomb. It will remove a great danger from us." The Soviet Union immediately accelerated its own nuclear program, setting the stage for the arms race which would define the Cold War. The term Cold War finds its origins in the writings of George Orwell, Britain's most notable anti-communist communist. In his 1945 essay, You and the Atom Bomb, Orwell describes a world living under the shadow of nuclear threat as one experiencing a peace that is no peace, which he termed a permanent Cold War. Orwell explicitly framed this conflict as the ideological confrontation between the Soviet Union and the Western powers. The new war did not begin suddenly after World War II. Its roots lay in the ideological and geopolitical tensions which had existed long before the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Anti-communism had been a core tenet of Western imperialism throughout the 20th century. The defeat of the Axis powers merely shifted the focus back to the Soviet Union as the primary adversary of capitalism. Even before the war ended, the Western Allies had begun courting Nazi officials and scientists who could provide valuable intelligence on the Soviet Union. Operation Paperclip, a secret U.S. program, brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, including former Nazis, to work in the United States after the war. Among them was Wernher von Braun, who had developed the V-2 rocket for Nazi Germany and later became a key figure in the U.S. space program. Reinhard Gehlen, a former Nazi intelligence officer, became a key asset for the U.S. Gehlen had led German military intelligence on the Eastern Front and later established the Gehlen Organization, which employed former SS and Wehrmacht officers to spy on the Soviet Union in collaboration with the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, known more popularly as the CIA. This organization eventually became the foundation of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. The Western Allies also worked to preserve the economic structures which had supported the Nazi regime. Many German industrialists who had profited from the war, such as those from companies like IG Farben and Krupp, were allowed to retain their wealth and influence in post-war West Germany. Figures like Alan Dulles, a future director of the CIA, played a key role in these efforts. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as the global leader of anti-fascism. The Red Army's role in defeating Nazi Germany and liberating Eastern Europe had earned the USSR immense prestige and moral authority. Across Europe, workers and communities inspired by the Soviet example began to take control of production and organize politically to challenge capitalism. In nations such as Italy, France, and Greece, workers' councils and partisan movements inspired by Soviet socialism gained significant influence. Even in countries where communist parties did not come to power, the war had shaken the foundations of capitalism and colonialism. The rise of social democracy in Western Europe was in large part in response to the Soviet model. Unsurprisingly, the Western powers viewed these developments with alarm. The fear of a popular tide of communist expansion led to the adoption of two key containment policies, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. The Truman Doctrine aimed to counter Soviet influence, while the Marshall Plan sought to stabilize capitalist economies in Europe. To bolster these efforts, a narrative developed in the West portraying the Soviet Union as a colossus hell-bent on expansion and global domination. Winston Churchill's infamous 1946 Iron Curtain speech, delivered at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, is considered a key moment in the early stages of the Cold War. In the speech, Churchill dramatically declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Eastern Europe, led by the totalitarian Soviet Union. While the speech is well known, less attention has been given to Stalin's response. In an interview shortly after the speech, Stalin offered a pointed rebuttal. When asked about Churchill's remarks, he responded, "I appraise it as a dangerous act, calculated to sow the seeds of discord among the Allied states and to cause difficulty to their collaboration. The essence of the affair is that Mr. Churchill now assumes the position of a warmonger, and Mr. Churchill is not alone in this. He has friends not only in England, but also in the United States of America. It should be noted that Mr. Churchill and his friends strikingly recall in this respect Hitler and his friends. Hitler began the task of unleashing war by proclaiming the racial theory, declaring that only people who spoke the German language constituted a full-fledged nation. Mr. Churchill, too, has begun the task of unleashing war with a racial theory, stating that only nations who speak the English language are full-fledged nations which are called upon to rule the destinies of the whole world. The German racial theory led Hitler and his friends to the point where the Germans, as the only full-fledged nation, were supposed to dominate other nations. The English racial theory leads Mr. Churchill and his friends to the conclusion that the English-speaking nations, as the only full-fledged ones, should start to dominate the rest of the nations of the world. In essence, Mr. Churchill and his friends in England and the USA have presented the non-English-speaking nations with something like an ultimatum. Recognize our dominance voluntarily, and then all will be in order. In the contrary case, war is inevitable. But nations have shed their blood in the course of 5 years of cruel war for the freedom and independence of their countries, and not to exchange domination by Hitler for domination by Churchill. It is wholly probable, therefore, that the non-English-speaking nations, which include the great majority of the population of the world, will not agree to accept a new slavery. Mr. Churchill's tragedy is that he, as an inveterate Tory, does not understand this simple and obvious truth. Mr. Churchill declares that Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, Sofia, all these famous cities, and the population of the surrounding region are in the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in this or that form, not only to Soviet influence, but also a significant degree to the increasing control of Moscow. Mr. Churchill characterizes all this as the boundless, expansionist tendencies of the Soviet Union. It does not require much effort to show here that Mr. Churchill crudely and impudently slanders both Moscow and the aforementioned states, which are neighbors of the USSR. One must not forget the following circumstances. The Germans launched the invasion of the USSR through Finland, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The Germans were able to launch the invasion through these countries because in these countries there were then governments which were hostile to the USSR. As a result of the German invasion, the Soviet Union has lost about 7 million persons forever in battle with the Germans and, also thanks to the German occupation, in the carrying off of Soviet people into German forced labor. Needless to say, the Soviet Union lost several times more people than England and the United States of America put together. Possibly there is an inclination in some places to consign to oblivion these colossal sacrifices of the Soviet people, which secured the liberation of Europe from the Hitler yoke. But the Soviet Union cannot forget them. It may be asked what can be surprising about the Soviet Union wanting security in the future, about its attempts to see that in these countries there are governments who have loyal relations with the Soviet Union. Is it possible, without taking leave of one's senses, to characterize these peaceful efforts of the Soviet Union as expansionist tendencies of our state? Despite Western propaganda, the USSR under Stalin in the post-war period was not focused on expansion or war, but on the preservation and strengthening of peace. These efforts are perhaps best illustrated by the Soviet Union's initiatives within the newly founded United Nations. In 1946, the USSR proposed a global ban on nuclear and bacteriological weapons. In 1947, it sponsored a UN resolution condemning war propaganda. In 1948, it called for the conventional armed forces of the 5 great powers to be reduced by 1/3. And in 1949, it advocated for an explicit peace pact among the 5 major powers. These proposals were part of a broader Soviet peace offensive at the UN, championed by Andrei Vyshinsky, the former lead prosecutor of the Moscow trials, who represented the USSR on the international stage. Alongside these efforts, the Soviet Union made several concessions in the post-war period as a gesture of goodwill toward the Western allies. In 1946, Stalin withdrew Soviet military forces from Iran and Manchuria, refused to support Greek communists in their uprising, and honored the Soviet promise to evacuate the occupied Danish island of Bornholm. Additionally, Stalin initiated a massive demobilization of troops in 1945 and implemented dramatic cuts in military expenditures. As historian Jeffrey Roberts argues, Stalin hoped, at least for a time, to establish a continued peaceful coexistence with the wartime allies, buying the Soviet Union much-needed time to recover from the devastation of the war. The most pressing international issue for the USSR was the future of post-war Germany. The Soviet Union was determined to maintain peace in Germany, even to the point of considering relinquishing its own authority in East Germany. For a deeper dive into this topic, we recommend checking out episodes on the German Democratic Republic we've done on Prolspod and on friend of the show, Actually Existing Socialism. What is sufficient to note for our purpose is Stalin's clarity on the reality of a permanently divided Germany. Whatever proposals we made on the German question, the Western powers won't agree with them, and they won't withdraw from West Germany. To think that the Americans will compromise or accept the draft peace treaty would be a mistake. The Americans need an army in West Germany in order to keep control of Western Europe. They say the army is directed against us. Actually, the army stays to control Europe. The Americans are drawing West Germany into the NATO pact. In West Germany, they will form West German forces. In West Germany, an independent state is being formed, and you must organize your own state. The demarcation line between West Germany and East Germany should be considered a frontier, and not just any frontier, but a dangerous frontier. It is necessary to strengthen the security of this frontier. In the first line of security will be the Germans, in the second line, Russian forces. The institution of NATO in 1949 occurred despite the extensive Soviet peace offensive and their own squashing of attempts within the new Eastern Bloc to form an internal military alliance. As often was the case, the Soviets were generally reactive when it came to Western machinations, never wanting to be credibly accused of stoking tensions. The new socialist states, which emerged in the latter half of the 1940s and early 1950s, included the following nations: the People's Socialist Republic of Albania, People's Republic of Bulgaria, Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, German Democratic Republic, Hungarian People's Republic, Socialist Republic of Romania, Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In addition were the recently added Baltic republics of the USSR, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The expansion of socialist states under the guidance of the USSR is often portrayed as the calculated execution of a pre-planned Machiavellian blueprint. However, no clear evidence supports this view. The post-war period saw nations within the Soviet sphere of influence undergo a unique transition towards socialism. This new arrangement of countries open to socialism within the Soviet orbit required a fresh theoretical foundation, leading to the development of the Marxist-Leninist theory of people's democracies. By 1950, this process had been largely completed. The concept of people's democracies provided a theoretical and practical framework for the transition from capitalism to socialism, particularly in Central and Southeast Europe after World War II. Rooted in the ideas of Lenin and Stalin, it was implemented first in countries liberated from Nazi occupation by the Soviet Union, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. A. Sobolev, writing in the Communist Review in 1952, elaborated on this concept, emphasizing its historical, political, and economic dimensions. The emergence of people's democracies was closely tied to the Soviet Union's decisive role in the region. The Red Army's liberation of these countries from fascist rule, combined with Soviet economic and political support, enabled local communist parties and working-class movements to establish new forms of state power. People's democracies evolved through distinct stages, reflecting changes in their class structures and political objectives. In the initial stage, the focus was on defeating fascism and imperialism. This involved agrarian reforms, the abolition of feudal remnants, and the formation of broad anti-fascist coalitions, which included the working class, peasantry, intelligentsia, and even segments of the middle bourgeoisie. The goal was to dismantle feudal and imperialist structures and establish a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Once power was consolidated, people's democracies entered a second stage, marked by the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat and beginning of socialist construction. This phase included the nationalization of industry, banks, and transportation, as well as the suppression of bourgeois resistance. The working class, led by communist parties, played a central role in guiding these transformations. Sobolev argued that people's democracies were not merely a local phenomenon, but had international significance. They represented a new form of state power which could serve as a model for other countries transitioning from capitalism to socialism in their own unique ways. The success of people's democracies in Europe and in Asia demonstrated the universal applicability of Marxist-Leninist principles adapted to specific historical and national conditions. While the Soviet Union played an active role, these new societies building themselves from the ashes retained a significant degree of autonomy. Contrary to popular belief, every decision was not dictated by Moscow. This geopolitical expansion saw Stalin, now in his 70s, managing these new fraternal diplomatic relationships alongside other party officials. These relationships did not always go as anticipated, with frequent disagreements which were exacerbated by power imbalances and differing objectives. Most notably the Stalin and Tito split, Tito being a key revolutionary figure of Yugoslavia, became deadly. To formally address some of these emergent challenges, organizations like Comecon, established in January 1949, were created to facilitate and coordinate the economic development of the Eastern Bloc. Organizations such as these were meant to regulate, order and plan the new global socialist economy. This was a brave new world for socialist construction. Never before had there been such a multiplicity of socialist experiments, which meant that these states were figuring out for the first time how to collaborate and act in solidarity outside of the capitalist world system. The concept of people's democracies ultimately signified the success of Stalin's Marxist-Leninist theory of socialism in one country. The existence and achievements of the USSR made it possible for the blossoming of socialism the world over.
Stalin's 70th birthday in December 1949 was a grand international celebration. Leaders from the newly established socialist countries attended. Streets were renamed in his honor, and statues and other commemorative works were presented across the Soviet Union. On December 20th, 1949, Stalin was awarded the Order of Lenin by the Supreme Soviet. Despite his own personal ambivalence towards the cult of personality surrounding him, Stalin was highly revered by the socialist world. These festivities attracted notable world leaders including Mao Zedong, the leader of China, and Walter Ulbricht, the Deputy Prime Minister of East Germany. In his final years, Stalin faced both deteriorating health and an increasingly complex political situation. His health was worsened significantly due to the physical toll of heavy smoking, atherosclerosis, a mild stroke around the time of the 1945 Victory Parade, and a severe heart attack in October 1945. These health issues, combined with the immense stress of leadership, left him increasingly frail. Despite his declining health, Stalin remained heavily involved in global and domestic politics. His schedule remained as full as ever, driven by his status as the face of the global communist movement. He also managed to complete two major theoretical works in his final years. The first, Economic Problems of the USSR, argued that the Soviet Union had reached a lower stage of communism. The work emerged from discussions about the creation of a new political economy textbook. It was quickly translated and became a foundational text for socialist political economists, especially in China. Stalin's other final work, Marxism and the Problems of Linguistics, was also a significant theoretical contribution to Marxist thought, taking Stalin down a new path of personal inquiry. Those writings marked the final intellectual efforts of Stalin, adding to his monumental theoretical legacy. When it came to the storm clouds brewing over the Korean peninsula, Stalin was initially reluctant to put his support behind Kim Il-sung, the leader of Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and Mao Zedong in the Korean conflict, fearing that it might escalate tensions and threaten global peace. Since the Great Patriotic War ended, socialists and leftists of all stripes had been mercilessly oppressed by the South Korean capitalist dictatorship. The North Korean invasion of the South was, contrary to popular belief, in response to this. We recommend that you check out the fantastic third season of the podcast Blowback, learn more about this conflict from the North Korean perspective. One of Stalin's key contributions to the Korean War was his decision to ramp up the Soviet nuclear program. Had the Soviet Union not achieved atomic weapons capability by 1949, there would have been little to deter the American generals from attempting to destroy these nascent socialist states, which came very close to during the conflict, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. Stalin also continued his efforts to unify Germany, advocating for a single German state up until 1952. However, his overtures were rejected by the West. In the years following the founding of Israel in 1948, Soviet policy toward the Middle East underwent a significant shift. Initially, the USSR had viewed Israel favorably, especially as a counterbalance to British imperialism. Israel's ambassador, Golda Meir, was in fact a prominent figure in Moscow's diplomatic circles. However, as the Cold War intensified and the US became more involved in the Middle East, Soviet attitudes toward Israel hardened. The USSR began to support Arab nations militarily and economically while starting to openly criticize Israel, developing a principled rhetoric of anti-Zionism. Unsurprisingly, this shift led some to accuse Stalin falsely of anti-Semitism. Robert Service, a Soviet historian, in his biography of Stalin, cautions against reducing Stalin's actions to prejudice. Rather, he suggests that Stalin's anti-Zionist rhetoric was rooted in realpolitik and anti-imperialist concerns. As Soviet relations with the US soured, Stalin began to view Zionist Jews, like other nationalists, as potential subversive elements. The circumstances surrounding Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, remain a subject of intrigue and speculation. Some, including his old associate, Molotov, were suspicious of the circumstances surrounding Stalin's death. Molotov believed that Stalin, who had shouldered enormous burdens, was drained and exhausted by the time of his final years, but was not deathly ill. Similar to Lenin's final years, palace intrigue fueled by the succession conversation laid heavily on the minds of party leadership, particularly those close to Stalin. The last international politician to meet with Stalin was KPS Memnon, the Indian ambassador. The following day, he recounted his experience of Stalin in his private journal, writing, "Everything about him is simple: his dress, his room, his manners, his modes of speech. This is the man whose will saved Russia for communism, and communism for the world. But for him, neither Russia nor communism would have been able to resist the assault of Hitler. This is the man held not only in his own country, but by millions all over the world as the leader and teacher of all progressive mankind, whose portraits have taken the place of holy icons in every Russian home, and at the mention of whose name, every audience in Russia rises to its feet, prolonged applause amounting to ovation. Yet adulation left no mark on him, than does water on a duck's back. There's not a trace of ostentation or affection about him. When Voltaire returned to Paris after many years in exile, he was greeted by a crowd of admirers. When a friend asked him whether or not he was pleased to be the people's idol, he replied, 'Yes, but an equally large crowd would have turned up if my head appeared on a scaffold.' That is the sentiment which Stalin himself would not hesitate to express. This leads me to the second quality, his shrewdness, which is shown as much by his silence as his speech. He declined to be drawn into a discussion of our Korean resolution. Perhaps he feels that he has come to the stage when he can devote his thoughts exclusively to fundamentals, leaving details to the henchmen. I was also struck by his ruthlessness. Twice he spoke of the futility of preaching morals to an evil person. Gandhi's phrase, "a change of heart," would mean nothing to Stalin. Perhaps it was to Gandhi's preoccupation with moral considerations that Stalin was referring when he drew the metaphor of the peasant's refusal to moralize with the wolf. I telegraphed to my government that this represented the essence of Stalin's philosophy. A few weeks after this meeting with Memnon, Stalin died. The most widely accepted theory is that Stalin died from a stroke. On the night of February 28, 1953, Stalin spent time at his favorite dacha with 4 of his closest comrades: Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin. The next day, Stalin failed to emerge from his room, prompting concern. However, it wasn't until late that evening that anyone entered the room, where they found Stalin unconscious and barely able to speak. Medical help was summoned the following morning, and Stalin was diagnosed with a major stroke. Despite efforts to save him, he lingered for several days before passing away on March 5, 1953. Stalin's death left a massive void at the heart of the Soviet system. In hours of his passing, a high-level meeting convened to address the enormous absence. As Dmitry Shepilov, the chief editor of Pravda, noted, Stalin's chair was left vacant, and no one could fill it.